Damian Collins. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. I wanted to structure our conversation in a way allowing us to look at the evolution of digital markets regimes in both jurisdictions, in both most important jurisdictions for our conversation, United Kingdom and the European Union. You've been at the cabin seat when the DMCCA was designed. You've been taking the ministerial role, and thus you've been one of the co-designers of this really remarkable, at least from the perspective of juristic craft and its ambition, regime. So let me maybe start this conversation by inviting you to look or to provide to us kind of unpacking of how this idea emerged, and obviously the journey from the idea to its embodiment into such important legislative piece is a long journey. So maybe you can highlight to us things which can be highlighted at this stage.
Yes. So, well, first, it's a pleasure to be with you on the podcast. Um, the journey, I suppose, towards the UK's digital market regulation probably really started with the Furman review, which was the review commissioned by uh, the government, by the UK Treasury, to ask Jason Furman to review digital markets and legislation in the UK. And that led to the recommendation of the creation of the Digital Markets Unit as a new unit within the Competition Markets Authority. Now, I think it was that Furman review was very important and came at quite an interesting time. It was published in the spring of 2019. There was other work being done elsewhere in the world looking at similar issues to do with digital markets regulation. There's a very good report written in Australia by the ACCC, the Australian Competition Authority. There was a very good committee piece of work done in the United States Congress, where the antitrust subcommittee, the Judiciary Committee there, did a big review of American antitrust regulation in digital markets. In fact, Lena Khan, who had become the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, she was the specialist advisor for the committee, which was chaired by David Cicilline, who I met at the time when he was doing this piece of work. So, and what was interesting about these different reviews is they largely built on the work the other had done as well. It felt there was a moment where there was a lot of international attention being done to the regulation of digital markets. People were looking at other major reports being produced in other countries and looking to build on that. So the UK process, in a way, maybe started before the European one did, although the Digital Markets Act in the EU was established before the UK legislation. The Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act was passed. But there was a lot of common thinking at the time. And I think probably the best way to really think about what governments were trying to do was really think about how the existing principles of competition law applied with the digital marketplaces, and where were their failings and what needed to be done about that. And in particular, you looked at, some things like sort of domination within a particular marketplace, where there certain services where one company had become the dominant provider, and therefore did that create an unfair market for that reason. Looking at issues like self-preferencing, where companies would cross-sell their own services to gain control of a market where they themselves already had a major strategic role in that market, and therefore would cross-sell other services to try and push competitors away. What evidence was there of that kind of behavior? And in digital markets, how easy was it to see? Did the regulators need special investigatory powers to go into companies and demand access to information and data that wasn't otherwise readily available? And the sort of wider context too, not just a competition policy, but the wider context too, which was this was going on at a time which is now referred to as the start of the techlash. The kind of, and I think really the trigger for that was the totally unrelated Cambridge Analytica scandal that that sort of blew up in 2018. Which was the idea that British political consultancy had scraped a large amount of Facebook user data from the platform to use in its digital marketing campaigns without user knowledge and consent. And what this opened up was a whole idea that companies acquired massive amounts of data about their users. They acquired data about what other apps they used. That informed commercial strategies that the major platforms deployed about competitors that they would acquire or kill along the way. And I think users suddenly realized just how much they were giving away in this transaction to use these free services. And there was, concern and suspicion about the way the companies behaved when they were challenged about these things too. So I think in some ways, whilst the sort of progress towards thinking about how do competition policy apply in digital markets had started some time before, by the time those ideas were really crystallized, it was happening at a moment when there was growing concern about the power of platforms, growing concern about user safety, data privacy, and then competition was the kind of next piece that was reviewed and became a cause of concern as well.
Now we also see that while in the past, in the early 2020s, there was a consensus among the supporters of this regime, now we see that people start looking at it differently. We obviously leave aside those who criticize it for or for several different reasons indeed. But what I see is that there are different groups are being crystallized of those who support and perceive this open textured objectives of the DMCCA differently. So there is a group which is focused on more kind of compensatory mechanism where we want to restore at least compensate at least part of the harm of this long-term harm which which undertakings with strategic market status have brought to the markets primarily vertically. There are also those who say that maybe it's also an opportunity to facilitate or to build our own stock, and maybe we shouldn't just tame them for the sake of taming, but maybe we should tame them where and when it is needed for the benefits of the UK own digital markets, because it is a must in the 21st century or whatever. So I wanted to learn your opinion and the opinion which was maybe the dominant one, or the strategy which was prevailing one in the mind of the government when co-designing this bill.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about digital market regulations for the tech sector is, and it's almost the key principle that underpins it is the same as the one that underpins safety legislation online as well. And indeed, really all areas of platform regulation is the starting point was not these companies are getting very big. How do we regulate them? Because regulating them is probably a good idea. It was more, how does existing regulation apply to companies like this? Are there business practices that if other people engaged in, there would be a remedy or an action against them that in the case of digital markets is not available? And in particular, is there a real problem around establishing what that case is, that requires data from within those companies to demonstrate a concern is valid, and therefore the regulator needs special powers to get access to that data and information as part of an investigation. But the start point is really, how do you apply the law? Now, I remember when I was Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy, we were looking at that point for a slot to bring forward the bill into Parliament. And I would hold ministerial roundtables with companies that were advocating for the CMA to be given these investigatory powers. And what they would say, and these were substantial businesses, they would say, look, I can tell you what I can tell you what my trading relationship is like with a major platform, the imbalance of power that they have, because I can't run my business and not access my customers using their platforms. But the terms of trade are dictated by them, often changed in ways that suit the platform, but to the detriment of me and my business. And I can't tell you I can't say this publicly. I could tell you in a private meeting, but I can't say this publicly because of the risk of some kind of punitive action by that platform against my business if I did. Now, that in and of itself, in a way, it was an example of the abuse of market power. But when you're talking about issues like online safety, the harms are very easy to see. Someone has been defrauded through a scam. A teenager has harmed themselves as a consequence of content they've been exposed to. Um, we know what sort of inciting racial hatred looks like, and therefore when we see it online, we know we should act against it. In digital markets, it's harder to unpack what these things are. So if you're a business and you're saying, well, if I have to sell through this major platform, um, that platform gains a huge amount of data about my business. When I do so, it can charge punitive fees. I can't do anything about that. I can't go anywhere else. There's a risk that if my product is successful, the platform will copy it and then preference an alternative supplier with which it has a commercial relationship. And there's nothing I can do about any of those things, and I can't go to another platform because I have to sell through that one. So you need to discover that evidence. You need to unpack that problem. On issues like self-preferencing, things that were easier to understand. In some ways, if you go back to the debates in Parliament when the bill was introduced, people talk quite a lot about things like app stores. There've been app store market study done by the CMA, which put a cost of in billions of pounds a year that was lost to UK consumers through overcharging through app stores. And what people can understand with app stores, because almost everyone uses one, is that when you have a digital economy where there are two operating systems, one run by Google and one run by Apple, there was at that time no interoperability between them, and therefore if you had an iPhone, you had to use the iOS operating system, you had to use Apple's App Store, and they could charge you what they liked. There's nothing you could do about it. And it was also discovered that there are cases where the application of those fees to the app developers wasn't consistent as well. So if you were a developer, you had to sell through those app stores and let Apple take its cut. And if you're a consumer, you had to pay that charge. There was no way around it. So when we had debates around, I think the browser market is a good example of this. That one of the things the government's been considering and the EU is considering through its through the omnibus process it's running on data policy is let's get rid of all those annoying cookies that pop up asking us to give our consent, because everyone clicks through them, no one reads them, they become totally pointless. So if you have browser level settings, then that's great. But then again, if the browser market is dominated by Google as it is through Chrome, then does that just mean you're giving Google all that data, which it has and doesn't have to share with anyone else at a huge market advantage? So are there remedies you should put in place to address that problem? And that's in some ways what the digital markets regime is looking to do, is look at business problems that we understand could exist, where we need better data and information to understand how that power is being used and if it's being abused, and therefore what either remedies should put in place to rebalance the market, or if there's strong evidence of abuse of market power by the platforms, what interventions should a regulator make? And I think, but it's all born out of that idea of how do you make understanding principles of what healthy competition looks like and pro-competition markets look like, and apply them to digital markets. And of course, let's not forget that you go to tech conferences, you talk to tech business people. The expression you keep on hearing is a moat. How big is your moat? So that'd be, how big is your unique offering to the market, which you protect and own? And because the value of your business, would often depend on the size of your moat. Sort of what do you protect and own? That Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur behind PayPal and an early investor in Facebook, and owner of Palantir, he said famously that competition is for losers. Kind of that what you want is dominance of a market that you can exploit, through a product or service that no one can do without, in which you totally dominate that market. So the starting point for the companies is really how can we make as much money as possible by developing businesses that are large and strategic and are gatekeepers for certain sectors of the market, and then exploit the value of that type of business. Well, that's very different to the way that competition policy works, where you believe that actually what competition does is it drives innovation, it drives productivity, it drives prices down for consumers and other businesses, and those are things that we associate with healthy markets.
I have several follow-up questions, but the last point requires further clarification. The message of scale, competition is for losers. We hear it very often, and we see that all big tech companies, all designated undertakings in EU and in the UK are super big, and
Yeah.
they are entrenched deeply, systemically, and there is not much we can do about it. And it looks that that's a precondition for success, for entering into other markets, etc. As a political man, I wanted to ask you: do you think that UK needs something of this kind, regardless of their kind of moral um, relativism, let's say, in order to succeed and in order to maintain its leading position in the global technological race, or we have to pursue our policy on a more kind of ethically superior ideas of competition, and or maybe believing that competition will actually allow us to build necessary capacity to continue playing the or continue being present in the top tier.
So I think that in general, the UK is still a large and important marketplace for tech businesses. So we shouldn't take the view that the UK is too small to have a national regime, and therefore, should either just decide either do what the Americans do or do what the Europeans do, but sort of don't try and don't try and go it alone. I don't think that is right. Um, I think we have to be realistic and say that UK regulators are not going to have probably the power to demand the breakup or restructuring of major global businesses that aren't headquartered in the UK. But there's no reason why we can't, within our own jurisdiction, set our own rules, and companies can decide whether or not to roll out services in the UK depending on those rules, or to put remedies in place for serving customers in the UK because of those rules. And I think, if we don't do that, then I think what will happen is we're saying that large global businesses, can behave as they like, even if their behaviour has a detrimental impact on UK businesses trying to offer and competing services. Has actually what we have at the moment is in major areas of the digital economy, the selling platform like Amazon that people use to reach their customers, cloud storage facilities that people use every day and businesses use to run, that if these are owned by a very small number of global companies, American companies in particular, um, and they basically set the terms of business for everyone else, is that a healthy place for the UK economy to be? Is there a danger that actually, as Tim Wu has said in his new book, that these businesses are extractive? That what they're doing is they're extracting value out of the economy. They are suppressing the development of other businesses. They pay relatively little tax for doing it. They have market dominant positions, which means they can overcharge if they want, because there's not much anyone can do about it. And we shouldn't think as well that even if some of the individual charges levied are relatively small, that overcharging doesn't matter, because you're talking about millions of users, and therefore it does matter. So is the inability of is what inability, but what is it so hard for UK businesses to develop and scale when competing in the tech sector? Not down to a lack of appetite or ingenuity or ideas or investment, but simply because you're competing against strategic gatekeepers that will try and block your access to the market. So we have to be mindful of all those things and setting what we think is the best national policy. I think UK tech regulation actually so far stands up there are some things I think the Europe has done well, which we should look at, but I think the UK regime stands up in pretty good comparison, I think, to the European one. I think, and actually, a lot of tech people will say that because in the UK you're dealing with the national regulator, it's often easier to work with and get guidance from than it is working in the EU.
And this leads me perfectly to my next question, namely your reflection. It's baby steps. It's too early. The regime is very ambitious, and you cannot start it functioning from scratch. We all understand this, but yet maybe 2026 allows us at least some preliminary reflections upon how the system is functioning in comparison to how the system was designed to function.
Yeah. So the question there is, I think, both for safety and competition in digital in the when you look at digital regulation, is about enforcement. We've given the CMA considerable power. Now, there's a question of, are they moving fast enough in designating businesses as having gatekeeper status within the sectors in which they operate. The European Commission has moved much faster in this regard in applying its designations. Should the CMA in the UK be doing that going faster? Should it be using its powers more widely, both in terms of investigation, but also in setting terms? Rather than, I think there was a lot of interest in some of the guidance given by the CMA or the agreements that it's come to with big companies on its market study on cloud computing, to actually say, also on app stores rather. So to say, actually, for the App Store market review to actually impose the remedies, to actually, rather than seek voluntary codes, because in some ways the reason we created the regime was we didn't think that voluntary codes would ever work or be enforceable. Now the CMA can look for the best, fastest remedies that can introduce and believe that'll be good for the market. It can always come back, and there is a question there about actually saying, in terms of the way we thought it would work and the way the CMA is using its powers, is it moving quick enough? Is it being, clear enough? And actually, rather than seeking consensus with the companies, actually setting what it thinks the terms should be. And I think so. In terms of this, so I think that's, if there's a concern at the moment, it's around, is the law being enforced in the way it was designed to be enforced yet? I think the same could be said with Ofcom and the Online Safety Act as well. Is Ofcom moving fast enough, using its powers widely enough? When we gave the regulators those powers, are they meeting yet those expectations? I mean, the other thing I'd say, which again I think is still quite a new regime, is that there's a limit to what the regulator can do. And in some ways we shouldn't leave it just down to the CMA to try and ensure there are effective remedies for abuse of market power by companies. And the other area is the law. So we created just over 10 years ago the ability to bring class action cases to the Competition Appeal Tribunal. We've had some landmark cases recently, particularly the Kent versus Apple case. Now there could be a lot more, and actually, and it was envisaged by Parliament when we passed the Competition Act that created the power for the Competition Appeal Tribunal to hear these cases, that actually, if companies understood that there was a very strong chance that a class action case could be brought against them by users who have suffered because of the way they've used their market power, then that in itself could be, a very good way of making companies self-regulate more effectively. Because if they were certain that failure to do so would likely lead to, multiple lawsuits against them, then they might take their obligations more seriously than they do. And those cases can be brought either as a follow-on from an intervention from the regulator, or as a standalone case as well. So I think, again, this regime in the UK is still relatively new, and what I would hope we'll see in the next few years, if you say what does it look like, say in 2030, is we will see effective action through the Competition Appeal Tribunal, and more market studies and interventions from the CMA as well.
Indeed. So what we see, and this is probably just the beginning with Kent versus Apple, is quite informative in terms of how big the stakes are and how much one can do with one decision, pretty much.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask.
Also, I think in digital markets as well, I think class action cases are particularly important, because you might have a group of people for whom the individual cost to them of market failure could be quite small in terms of an amount of money. But it might be £100 or something. Well, an individual in that case is never going to bring a lawsuit against Apple or Google or Amazon as a consequence of a loss of that kind. So can a company get away with failing to meet its obligations under competition law because the individual cost to a consumer is relatively low, and therefore they would never take legal action because it would be too big a risk for such a small reward? But when you have a large class of users, from all over the country, and certainly when it is an opt-out class action as well, where you can actually represent Google users in the UK, or then you've got the chance to properly fund that kind of litigation and bring those cases successfully. So I think in digital markets, it is really important that option exists.
But there is a specificity of judicial decisions versus regulatory or enforcement decision is with the later, we see wider room for regulatory dialogue where the SMS, the closer the moment of fine is approaching to them, or the closer the more they realize the inevitability of the positive decision accusing them or establishing infringement, non-compliance, the more willing they are to adjust on probably less important things for their business model and thus be more collaborative and more kind of open to softer compromises. Whereas with CAT doesn't have this mandate to have this steering role for digital markets in the UK. Its mission is to establish justice, the truth, rather than tailor digital markets. Do you think that this feature is the second best one, the one which we doomed to look to focus because the CMA is currently under larger political pressure than it usually is, or it's even better model, or they both complement each other, the enforcement by CMA and what we see private actions in the Competition Appeal Tribunal?
Yeah, so they support each other, and I agree with you. I think in some ways the best role for the regulator is in trying to help companies develop better models and better systems to work, to work with companies in that regard. And in some ways, I think for digital markets, particularly when you think about the advance of AI, is how can you create like a marketplace for good? How can you actually create positive incentives for businesses to do the right thing? And that could be that if you had a strong marketplace for good practice, where companies are employing positive upstream solutions within their businesses to make it less likely that there will be failures, then do they have reduced costs of business as the insurance costs they may pay to protect themselves from large fines or legal costs, are they reduced? Are there positive signs the regulator can take, that if there is a problem and it investigates it, and it can see the company try to behave responsibly and try to adjust to problems that it failed to anticipate and has done so in a responsible way, that there are positive sort of pro-market incentives for companies to do that. For example, in the case of, if you look at an issue like combating fraud, Google has a policy that you can't advertise financial services products using its ad systems if you're not regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, that doesn't mean the FCA is pre-checking every ad that's being placed, but it's a sensible upstream solution you could build in to say, okay, this is one of the ways in which we try and make sure only legitimate people are using our services. So how can you create more like market incentives for that kind of positive behavior? And the regulators can play a role in sending signals about what they think is good practice looks like. These are the sorts of things that if a company was doing the following things, then the regulator would take that into account if they were investigating them as a consequence of a failure that had become known about. So, or they would take that into account when conducting a market study or a review of the sector in which that company operated. So, I think that that would be good. I mean, I think financial services regulation has often failed, but I think on the whole, a bank or holder of a license knows that whilst they may not have the regulator standing over their shoulder looking at everything they're doing, they understand what their obligations are, and they know that if they fail to meet them, that the consequences could be quite severe. So that there's good reason to make sure that they do, and that they have compliance teams making sure that they are compliant, because they don't want to be in the position of being investigated for failure.
And how do
Whereas I
you,
think it does feel a bit in digital markets that, and this I think applies to safety policy, competition policy, and data policy, the big platforms largely just done whatever they wanted to do, in the knowledge that even if they got caught, even if they got found out, it's hard to prove, because external bodies don't necessarily have access to the data information they would need, upfront to investigate it. They've got the resources to challenge any legal action to challenge or appeal against regulatory decisions, and just fight as much as you can for as long as you can, knowing the regulators can't do it all. and it does feel in digital markets at times that the big tech platforms, um, you just use every trick in the book to delay any kind of intervention against them.
This sounds like a very sophisticated system of coordination between the CMA and Competition Appeal Tribunal. Obviously, it's non-verbalized coordination, like spontaneous emergence of spontaneous order out of mature democracy in which we have in the United Kingdom. I would make it rather as a triangle and add also the government, the central government, with its kind of political steer and strategic macroeconomic vision and ambition and interest, etc. How this communication between the three, CMA, CAT, and the government, should take place, are taking place? Do they have to verbalize this communication, or it is genuinely spontaneous by, well, probably CAT by the very structure is more open to different learning points. And yet, I wanted to ask your kind of internal perspective, because you've been inside and you are currently in this kind of league of communicators or mediums of these interests. How does it function for us academics to understand better?
Well, sorry, the government obviously can conduct reviews, and that's often quite a good way of getting the regulator, the government, together, and the sectors in which they operate, to discuss how their performance. The government have recently conducted a review into the Competition Appeal Tribunal, and which the government is, with a view to informing some reforms to that sector that the Department for Business may make or may publish and consult on later this year. So those sorts of consultations and reviews are an opportunity for the government to listen to outside opinion, consult with the regulator and the tribunal itself, and consider whether the system is working as it would like it to, or are there improvements that could be made, or should there be grounds for a different view on how this operates. So that's the kind of formal way in which the government can conduct those sorts of reviews. I mean, I think Parliament can play a role as well, and in some ways, I think this is something that in the House of Lords Digital and Communications Committee has called for. When I chaired the joint committee of both houses on the online safety bill, we called for this too, which is, say, there should be like a standalone committee of the Lords and Commons, which has oversight of the role of the regulators in the digital market. So the Information Commissioner, the Competition and Markets Authority, and Ofcom. I would say there's so much they have to do now all the time that the regular parliamentary committees just don't have the time to give the specialist attention that they should. And that should consider how the regulators are using their own powers and functions, but also how well they cooperate together, because there will be areas of joint interest in particular companies and where information sharing between the regulators would be desirable. But I think there needs to be some kind of scrutiny as to how the regulators are using those powers. The regulators they're given powers by Parliament and the government, and they are standalone and independent. But at the same time, it should be the job of both Parliament and the government to say, is the regulator using the powers it was given by us in the way in which we envisaged when we set them up? And that so that can be done through formal channels and reviews. But I think in some ways there's more we could do to, certainly through a parliamentary process, to try and make sure there is good ongoing monitoring of the performance of the regulators or the tribunal in considering how competition policy is implemented. With the government, within government too, there's always this charge that governments can send a very strong signal to regulators about whether they want them to go hard or not. If a regulator is criticised for not using its powers more aggressively, is that because behind the scenes the government is saying, we don't want you to, we're not going to repeal the legislation, but we don't want you to go in hard on these companies because of other strategic reasons that we have. Now, there is plenty of rumour and conversation about that sort of intervention, but I would say that on the whole, I think in general public support is with the remedies, is with the regulatory intervention. Actually, what you tend to see is more of a cry when people don't feel it's being enforced consistently and well. And I also think too, I think tech companies have relied far too much on a lobby voice saying, if you regulate the companies too hard, they won't invest in your country, they'll take their investment elsewhere. I'm not sure people really believe this anymore. I think people have questioned whether the investments that have been promised, would be delivered, you know, um, and whether, are they significant? Are they beyond what the companies would have made anyway, in order to serve what is still a very important commercial market for them? So I think, the tech companies have lobbied a lot on that. That actually the enforcement of regulation stifles innovation, puts up cost barriers for companies who would otherwise invest that money back in the UK, and it has a detrimental impact on the operation of the market. I don't believe that is true. I think increasingly people don't believe it's true, and I think when these things are reviewed and consulted on, the whole people say no, we want the laws that have been set to be operating more effectively.
And by the way, I remember how important and informative the role of both houses, committees of both houses were during the
Mm.
DMCC bill discussions, how wide the selection of witnesses was done, and how representative these voices were, and also the discussion was publicly available. Thus,
Yes.
we all were able to learn from different perspective. So it was really a really informative mechanism present, both in the European Union as well to a large extent. So we are privileged to have this accessibility to this information.
That's right. I think that's right, and I think what people can see as well is that, what the sort of growing dominance of certain companies means, and the impact that has on choices consumers have, and prices that they pay, and businesses in particular understand very well the consequences of being on, having a bad relationship with one of these major platforms. I think one of the ways in which, I think, in the BBC Charter review coming up, there will be, I think, considerable focus on the growing market power of YouTube as a distributor of television. How it uses that power, the benefit it gets from it, the impact it has on other service providers. And I think as time goes on, there'll just be more and more cases like that become really clear. And actually, the public expectation will be not, oh, we shouldn't hold back companies like YouTube, but rather we should be making sure there's a fair marketplace for others to compete as well.
Mm, my next question is less about the platform economy as such, but more about the infrastructural aspects, namely cloud and maybe AI. I don't know, AI is in between somewhere, and yet it's about computational capacity to large extent. So it's about infrastructure, physical infrastructure. Do you think we have to have or the government is doing enough in terms of attracting investment? Should it how important it is to be selective in terms of the jurisdiction where the investment is coming from. Should it be coming from the UK itself? Is it something of strategic importance for the country for the future years? Or the most important thing is to generate investment, and thus the sending party jurisdiction is of secondary importance?
So I think so that there are a couple of really important questions there. I think, so. Firstly, in terms of the infrastructure itself, I think that is largely, if you like, that's a kind of physical engineering challenge, if you like. So I think probably the most important thing that a country could do to make itself attractive for bringing in that investment is not so much about the way it enforces its competition or data protection legislation, but about the physical resources that are available. I mean, you need a lot of electricity, and you need a lot of water. You need water to cool them, the data centers, and you need electricity to run them. And the tech companies ideally want low or zero carbon forms of energy. So you would say actually your grid infrastructure, your capacity to supply, the security of that supply, and the cost of it are major business decisions that a big company will make when looking at where it's going to locate sort of data storage and data processing centers. So I think there needs to be, a proper national plan around that. Now, the government have identified, have launched the idea of having AI growth zones where you could have, the resources, facilities you would need on common sites, that would be attractive for businesses to go there. But I think that's what you need to do. You need to map out, okay, well, where are we going to generate the electricity to supply the companies that are looking to work in the UK to power the compute power and the storage facilities that you need in order to operate at scale in these markets. So I think that is really important, and I don't think people should see, well, actually, we should just water down the regulations to try and stop people doing it. I think there's an interesting debate in Europe now as well, actually, whether you need a single European regulator as well. I mean, that it's no coincidence that the big American platforms in the EU headquartered mainly, most of them in Ireland. I think Amazon are in Luxembourg. Their official registration is located in countries where they may feel the enforcement regime is more favourable. Therefore, it's chosen to go there. I think in time in the EU that'll probably change. And they'll want more consistent regulatory alignment by the national agencies that gets rid of that incentive to be one country or another. But for the UK, I think we absolutely should be embracing the kind of infrastructure and energy challenge of big tech and making ourselves a really attractive place to be, through nuclear power, renewable energy, a lot of water in the UK. We should be thinking strategically about sites which would meet all these objectives. And I think that's probably the best way to win that investment is by having the best resources and infrastructure to support it.
We see now with AI and cloud, it looks like we move to another generation, for the next generation of digital markets. And usually at these bifurcation points, we see that the leader's status is being challenged by newcomers who are more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and the leaders become a little bit more complacent. And so that's if there is an opportunity in digital markets to change the Yahoo to Google or something of this kind, it is usually when these big shifts are happening. In your view, do you think that the leaders of today, digital leaders of today, have learned the lessons of their success, their own success, and they are trying to be strategically very defensive against any new challenger, trying to do killer acquisition or maybe maturing their own position in this specific way, or the Cinderella story is still possible and we will see some new faces in these markets in the following years?
It's a good question. I mean, AI is the obvious area where people would point to, OpenAI in particular, and say, the biggest challenge to what seemed to be the dominant position of Google in search, which could never be overcome. That could be challenged now by an AI company that develops a different type of service, which actually is preferable to using search services, and therefore changes the market. So I think that can happen. But at the same time, the sheer amount of data that a company like Google controls, has access to, and gathers all the time through its different services, means that if being in possession of that volume of data is still important, then they have a massive, market incumbent position, which should make them the leader in the development of AI. Now, it may well be that actually AI develops in ways where actually starting with that amount of data, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up with the best product or the one that people use. So therefore there can be those changes. But I think what you can't say is, well, because there is something new may come along, we shouldn't worry about the market as it exists today, because the chances are it will be disrupted by other things. Now, I'd rather be in a position where we try and make sure there is, fair regulation of the markets as they exist. Now, when you can see that maybe a market dominant position is being eroded by a competitor, or the market dynamic has changed completely, then of course the regulators should review the position of those companies within the market itself. But I think clearly AI and agentic AI, are new technologies that will change the markets. The question will be, does Alphabet, Google, and Meta, which comes into this with massive amounts of data that it holds because of the way it gathers it from its users, do they inevitably end up winning simply because of that market power? Or can they be disrupted by new entrants? I think the argument that they have lost, though, is the idea of it being a closed source technology controlled by 4 or 5 companies. I think maybe through the demonstration of the Chinese, actually, I think open source AI, I think is an inevitability. I don't think it's going to be something that I think that can be controlled by one or two gatekeepers or four or five gatekeepers, and then everyone else basically uses it through them rather than having, access to foundational models themselves. I think that's, I think the ability to control the market in that way is gone. So I think there will be room for innovation, but what we have to think about is how does competition policies apply? How do you enforce self-preferencing on agentic AI? Where if you're using an AI agent to book your holiday for you, does the AI agent always work in your best interests or in the interests of the company that built it, and the commercial relationships it has, and how can you expose that and who's responsible? So these are the sorts of challenges we'll have to cope with.
I have last two questions, recommendations to students and your plans for the second half of 2026. But I also have a kind of an additional question if you have an extra minute. You mentioned the importance of infrastructure, etc. So a paranoid mind might imagine or project the scenario where authoritarian regimes would say, okay, what do you need for the next generation of success in digital markets? You need energy. I have cheap energy. I multiply by 10. I have access to water and access to to physical resources multiplied by 10. I have access to data. I control all the steps of my citizens, and I can pump this data into these data centers. And what I don't have is entrepreneurial mind, perhaps. Okay, that's the minus. Maybe I can purchase it or etc. But should we worry that this physical tech is becoming more easy to construct at higher scale by those who don't care about democratic values and who have built their infrastructure using human lives as a foundation, but not metaphorically but physically, and they will somehow replicate this story, or it is they will never be able to achieve success in comparison to the current trendsetters.
Yeah, I think if it was a company that was being built out of, say, Russia, where those conditions would probably apply, would it, well, the chance, I mean, firstly, its access to other markets could be blocked. If I think if a big market incumbent sought to use those footprints in other countries like that, where there was a more favourable terms of trade, then I think they would suffer a degree of brand jeopardy and consumer trust issues if they pursued that path. I think about still think people are going to care about where their data is being held and processed, and what could be done with it. And so, where possible, people may gravitate towards services where that wasn't the case, or people won't use it in the same way that people often make consumer choices about, depending on where a company sources its products from and how they manufacture them. People may do the same with technology products too, if they can, if the option of doing so still exists. So I also think for companies like that as well, the incentive to build in the West and to be in democratic countries that tends to be where the wealthier consumers are as well. So if you want to sell what you're making, sell the service you're providing to customers in countries like France and Germany or the United States, then you're going to want to be compliant with their laws and be viewed well in those markets.
Okay, thank you. 2026, we are moving to approaching the summer break, but then we will be having very hot autumn. What should our attention be focused at, or your attention will be focused at in the second half of 26?
Well, on these issues, I suppose there will be government consultation on the Competition Appeal Tribunal. So we'll see shortly probably what recommendations for reform, if any, the government will make, and then there'll be a consultation on that. I think there'll be ongoing interest in the role of the Competition and Markets Authority in using its powers, and how it'll probably expect further market studies and announcements from the CMA on market investigations and the designation of sort of strategic market status for some companies and providers. Within all that work will carry on. I think there's going to be an ongoing debate around what effective regulation of AI looks like. The EU will probably not commence a number of its powers under the AI Act, and therefore, I think there's no settled position, I would say, really on what AI regulation looks like yet. As I said before, I think the idea of trying to establish a kind of marketplace of good practice could be a very positive way of looking at the AI market. Also, I think recognizing that AI wasn't invented with large language models. There's a slight sometimes when we talk about AI as if it sort of that was the big bang moment and didn't exist before that. Well, of course, AI has existed for a very long, as a term has existed for a very long time, and we should recognize that we effectively do regulate AI already in a number of different ways. The question is that regulation effective enough? I think in some ways what government should be doing is, rather than just passing new laws, which is a process, is actually looking at the enforceability of existing laws and existing powers we have, and saying, well, actually, let's make those work, and if we can't, then let's do something new. But let's and let's not try and treat the AI sector as a new and discrete thing, but recognizing it's going to be part of most of our lives and most of the services that we use. And therefore, are the existing market regulations going to be effective, or do we have to build something new to meet those new challenges? And I think that's what we should be doing. I think the mistake the EU made was leaping to try and do it all in one go through the AI Act, which I think is probably not enforceable. There's a lot of good things in it, but needs to be reviewed.
And final recommendations for students.
Well, I mean, for students that have an interest in these subjects, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. So, it's a great opportunity to, I think, take an interest in what's going on in different countries around the world, because everyone's feeling their way a little bit on this. So, I would think, don't just look at what's going on in the country where you live, but how does that compare with what's going on in Australia or Canada, in particular, in the EU? If you're a UK citizen, if the Democrats take control of Congress in November, what would you see a return of some of the thinking that was there 5 or 6 years ago around market regulation, and will there be changes there too? So I think it's a very dynamic situation.
Damian Collins, thank you for sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you very much for having me.